Welcome to Capitalism That Works, a series co-produced by GlobalTreehouse and myself, Jesper Koll. In today's session, I want to talk about the saving superpower Japan. And it's interesting, because many people who look at Japan, one of the first things they see is the enormous fiscal deficit. And yes, it's very true, Japan's public sector has debt in excess of 250% of GDP, which is more than twice the equivalent of what you've got in the United States of America. So yes, the public sector is an enormous debtor, but the flip side of that is that the private sector, corporate Japan, and the household sector is actually incredibly rich. So let's have a look at some of the data behind it and some of the driving forces. And when you look at the listed companies in Japan, and remember, listed companies are supposed to be the greedy ones, right? They're supposed to generate the highest rate of return to maximize profit under any circumstances. But when you look at listed companies in Japan, you find that they have an incredible pile of retained earnings and cash balances. In fact, the cash on the balance sheet of listed companies has surged over the last 10 years from about 20% of GDP to over 130% of GDP. In comparison, in the United States, cash balances of listed companies stand at around 45% of GDP. So there's no question that corporate Japan excels at accumulating cash at a very, very high rate. Now, when you compare this to other countries, you see that practically everywhere, whether it's France, whether it is China, whether it is Korea, those corporate cash balance have been building up. And of course, after the global financial crisis, companies wanted to have a cash cushion, they wanted to have a war chest just in case the financial system has a seizure so that they can continue to actually finance themselves. But corporate Japan is the big global champion. By the way, there's one country that does not have large corporate cash balances, and that, of course, is Germany. And the reason is that Germany is the one country in the world that has a fundamentally different system of corporate governance, with the corporate board, half of the board members coming from the labor unions. So the moment there is excess cash that is generated, the labor unions demand that this goes into wages in Germany. Now in Japan, where does the cash that is generated go? Does it go to capital or does it go to labor? If you look at how much of the operating cash flow goes back to the shareholders, so back to the capitalists, the shareholders' payout ratio, so that's dividends and share buybacks, in Japan stands at around 25%. That is about half of what it is in the United States of America with 50%. So there's no question that America is much more focused on giving money to the capitalists, while in Japan, the capitalists get about a quarter of the operating cash flow. Well, if capital does not get the cash flow, does labor get it? And this is interesting, because there is this mythology that corporate Japan is this workers' paradise, right? Where you've got lifetime employment, where you've got all the job security, but that comes at the expense of actually relatively low payback to the workers of the profit that actually is coming through. And in fact, you find that Japan, the workers' compensation as a percentage of corporate profits, as a percentage of corporate value add, is one of the lowest in the OECD, with the large companies paying barely 38% of value add back to the workers. In the United States, that's not 38%, but that's closer to 50%. And in Germany, that's closer to 80%. So it's interesting that here in Japan, the way corporate leaders run their companies, it is neither capital nor labor that get the lion's share of the free cash flow that is being generated. Instead, the lion's shares actually continues to go into the building up of retained earnings, into the building up of cash balances. And that puts Japan in a very, very strong position. Because if and when the next global recession comes, if and when the next global downturn comes, corporate Japan will be able to use that war chest of cash to actually buy on the cheap some of the global companies that are there. In the meantime, also these high cash balances by corporate Japan invite a lot of activist investors because they want to put pressure on management to increase the payback via dividends or share buybacks to capital. But for the time being, corporate Japan continues to be very, very focused on being the corporate sector that is the savings champion of the world, of corporations in the world. Now, labor being cheap is also reflected in the fact that actually, contrary to some of the perceptions, you find that managers in Japan have now become relatively cheap. For example, to the average executive director at a listed company now has compensation of about 25 million yen. In the US, that is about twice as expensive. Even Shanghai is more expensive, as is Korea and Vietnam. So it's interesting that, the fact that corporate Japan has been very good at managing down its cost now actually means that labor, that managers in Japan have actually become relatively cheap. The corporate sector saves, the corporate sector accumulates cash, but so does the household sector. If you look at Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe, if you look at the consumer, the number one marker of Japanese consumers is that they are the savings champions of the world. Let's be specific. You see that over the last 10 years, when the economy was doing much better, you actually found that workers' compensation, so pay for the household sector, rose by about 40 trillion yen. But consumption only rose by 7.2 trillion yen. So while the labor market improved, while the economy improved, Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe, yes, got more income, got better jobs, but they did not open their purses, they did not begin to actually spend. And that's the big mystery that we actually have in Japan. Why is it that the private corporate sector and the private household sector is so dead set on savings? And of course, for the household sector, one plausible explanation is indeed the fact that yes, the public sector, the fiscal deficit is so very high. The fear of cutting back some of the national health care or national service provisions, that fear is very, very highly ingrained amongst the Japanese, and as a result of that, you do have a strong preference for savings rather than spending the money that you actually earned. So the household sector, Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe, live in permanent fear of taxes actually going up. And it's very interesting, when you look at the degree of income taxation, you find that Japan is actually much lower than in the United States. Total income taxes collected are only running at about 5% of GDP in Japan, while it is about 12% in the United States of America. And there is a big fear amongst Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe that given how high the public sector deficit is, that sooner or later the Japanese government is going to continue to increase taxes, and that's one reason for why the household sector savings rate is indeed so high, and it's one reason for why indeed you've got such a saving superpower of the private sector here in the Japanese system. Thank you very much. This is Capitalism That Works, a series produced by GlobalTreehouse and Jesper Koll. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please have a look at some of the other sessions that we have produced. Thank you very much.